Someone just passed away from Hantavirus in New Mexico last week, and the details coming out of that case are making infectious disease specialists genuinely nervous. Not the kind of nervous they perform for cameras, the kind of nervous where they're quietly updating their protocols and having conversations they don't want the public to hear yet. Today we're going to talk about why Hantavirus is suddenly back on everyone's radar, what's actually changing, and why the combination of factors emerging right now could make this one of the most dangerous periods we've seen for this particular pathogen in decades. Let's start with something most people don't know. Hantavirus has always been here. It never left. It circulates quietly in rodent populations across North America, South America, Asia, and Europe. And most years, it kills people without making major headlines. In the United States alone, since researchers began tracking it seriously in the early 1990s, the case fatality rate for the most severe form has hovered somewhere between 35 and 40%. Let that number sink in. When people contract hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, the version that attacks the lungs, roughly 1 in 3 doesn't survive. That's not a misprint. That's the actual mortality rate for a virus that already exists in the wild spaces most Americans visit every single summer. So if it's always been this deadly, what's changed? Why are doctors alarmed right now specifically? 3 things are converging simultaneously, and that convergence is what's making epidemiologists lose sleep. The first factor is the rodent population explosion happening across multiple regions right now. Deer mice, which are the primary reservoir for hantavirus in North America, experience dramatic population swings tied to food availability. When there's an abundant seed crop or massed event, deer mouse populations can multiply several times over within a single season. What we've seen across parts of the American Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the Mountain West over the past 18 months is exactly this kind of explosion. More mice means more opportunities for human exposure. More exposure means more cases. It's almost mechanical in its logic, but the scale of the current boom is genuinely unusual. The second factor is where things get darker. Climate patterns are reshaping where these rodents live, how far they range, and critically, how long they survive. Milder winters that would historically have suppressed rodent populations are now allowing them to persist through seasons that used to function as natural population controls. Deer mice are appearing in elevations and geographic zones where they weren't commonly found a decade ago. This means people are encountering the virus in places they never thought to be cautious. Someone hiking a trail in a region with no historical hantavirus activity can now encounter an infected animal because the range has quietly shifted. The third factor is the one doctors find most unsettling. Our relationship with wild spaces changed permanently during the pandemic years, and it never fully reversed. Millions of Americans who began camping, hiking, off-grid living, and rural exploration during lockdowns have continued those activities. Many of them are sleeping in cabins, sheds, and structures that have sat unused for months or years. And here's the critical piece of information that far too few people understand about hantavirus. You don't have to touch a rodent. You don't even have to see one. You just have to breathe in dust from a space where an infected mouse has urinated, defecated, or nested. The virus can survive in dried rodent droppings for days. When someone opens an old shed and starts sweeping, or clears out a cabin that's been closed all winter, they're potentially aerosolizing infectious particles without any warning sign whatsoever. This is the dark truth that the headline actually references, and it's more disturbing than most people realize. There is no smell, no visible indicator, no symptom in the rodent, and no obvious contamination marker. The danger is completely invisible until it isn't. And when symptoms appear, they arrive looking exactly like the flu. Fatigue, fever, muscle aches. Doctors across rural areas are trained to ask about potential rodent exposure, but many patients never volunteer that information because they don't realize a clean-looking, dusty old barn counts as a rodent exposure risk. By the time hantavirus pulmonary syndrome develops, which happens in its severe form somewhere between 4 and 10 days after initial exposure, fluid begins accumulating in the lungs at an extraordinary rate. Patients can go from walking into an emergency room to requiring mechanical ventilation within 24 hours. The speed of deterioration is something emergency physicians describe with consistent horror. You're treating someone who looks sick but stable, and then the window closes extremely fast. There's also a surveillance problem that researchers are now openly discussing. Hantavirus cases are likely undercounted, not because of conspiracy or incompetence, but because of how the disease presents. Rural patients who develop flu-like symptoms in early stages frequently never seek care, recover on their own if the infection is mild, and get counted as nothing. The cases that get counted are the severe ones, the ones that end up in hospitals. The actual rate of exposure and mild infection in the population may be significantly higher than official numbers suggest, which tells us the virus is circulating more actively than the case numbers imply. Now here's where the psychology of risk becomes important to understand. Humans are wired to fear vivid, dramatic threats. Viruses spread through the air in crowded cities, outbreaks with news coverage, diseases with visible symptoms. Hantavirus fits none of those categories. It's quiet, rural, individual, and random seeming. This makes it genuinely difficult for people to calibrate their risk accurately. The threat isn't loud enough to generate sustained public attention, but it's dangerous enough that anyone spending time in rural environments in affected regions should be taking it seriously. What can actually be done? The practical information here is more actionable than you might expect. When entering any structure that has been closed for an extended period, especially in regions with active deer mouse populations, you should ventilate the space for at least 30 minutes before entering. You should never sweep or vacuum dried rodent droppings dry. Wetting them thoroughly with a disinfectant solution before cleaning, then removing them while wearing gloves and ideally an N95 respirator is the protocol recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Sealing food sources, eliminating entry points into structures, and using rodent exclusion methods around cabins and rural homes significantly reduces exposure risk. If you develop flu-like symptoms within 2 weeks of potential rodent exposure in any form, including spending time in rural areas with known deer mouse activity, tell your doctor specifically about that exposure. Those 2 words, potential exposure, can change the clinical conversation in ways that matter enormously to your outcome. Supportive care in an intensive care setting dramatically improves survival odds compared to being treated as a standard respiratory illness and discharged. The reason doctors are scared right now isn't that hantavirus has mutated into something new, though researchers do monitor for that possibility. The reason is that the conditions for increased human exposure are stacking up in a way we haven't seen in combination before. Larger rodent populations in expanded ranges, more people in wilderness spaces without historical knowledge of the risk, and a healthcare system that can easily miss early presentations until it's nearly too late. The virus doesn't need to change to become more dangerous. It just needs better access to people who don't know it's looking for them. And right now, in the spring of 2026, as people head into rural areas for the season, that's exactly the situation quietly developing across multiple regions of the country. The most dangerous threats are often the ones nobody's talking about loudly enough. This is one of them. Share this with anyone you know who camps, hikes, or spends time in rural structures, because what they don't know genuinely could kill them. Stay aware, stay cautious, and we'll see you in the next one.